For more than 7 centuries, one family held Portugal together. From the cold Atlantic shore where the land ends and the ocean begins, the House of Braganza ruled a kingdom that at its height commanded the first truly global empire the world had ever seen. They planted their flag on 4 continents. Their ships carried spice, gold, and enslaved people across waters no European power had charted before them. Their court in Lisbon glittered with Brazilian diamonds and colonial wealth so vast that the English and the Dutch spent generations trying to pry pieces of it away. Portuguese navigators named the winds, charted the capes, and wrote the sea routes into the logs that all of Europe would eventually copy. The dynasty that presided over that age of discovery was not a footnote to the story. It was the story, woven into the founding myths of a small nation at the far western edge of the continent that had somehow reached further than any of its larger neighbors. And then, in October of 1910, it was over. Not slowly, not through war or conquest, but in 44 hours. A republic was proclaimed before most of the capital had even woken up. The last king of Portugal, a young man of 19 named Manuel II, walked out of his palace at Mafra and boarded a yacht. He sailed away from a country that had just decided almost overnight that it no longer wanted a king, and the family he left behind, the dynasty that had ruled Portugal since 1640, was scattered to the wind before the month was out. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What happened next is a story that most histories of Portugal skip over. The Republic declared itself, wrote its laws, and moved on. The Braganzas became an embarrassment, a relic, a footnote. Their palaces were seized, their property redistributed, and the family that had given the world Vasco da Gama's successors, the family whose king had once fled to Brazil aboard a fleet of ships rather than bow to Napoleon, was told to leave and not come back. Some of them did leave, some never returned. And the ones who stayed in exile carried with them a claim to a throne that the official record was not particularly interested in preserving. To understand what the exile meant, you have to understand what the Braganzas were losing. This was not a minor European monarchy clinging to a provincial crown. The house that came to power in 1640, when the Duke of Braganza rose against 60 years of Spanish rule and proclaimed himself Fulwell IV, had built one of the most consequential empires in human history. Brazil alone, which remained under Portuguese rule until 1822, had transformed Lisbon into one of the wealthiest courts in Europe. The gold and diamonds that poured out of Minas Gerais in the 18th century funded palaces, churches, and libraries that still stand today, their grandeur almost incomprehensible against the modest scale of the country that built them. By the 19th century, however, the empire had contracted. Brazil was gone. The African colonies remained but were expensive to maintain and increasingly difficult to defend against European competitors. The monarchy itself had become a constitutional arrangement, with kings who reigned but did not govern, presiding over a political class that was perpetually at war with itself. Portugal in 1900 was a country where nearly 70% of the population could not read, where the gap between Lisbon's educated elite and the rural poor was as wide as any in Europe, and where Republican and anarchist movements had spent decades building the argument that the monarchy was the source of national stagnation rather than its solution. The man on the throne when the Republic came was Carlos I. He had tried to govern through strong ministers rather than through parliamentary consensus, and in 1908, 2 members of a Republican conspiracy shot him dead in his open carriage in the Praça do Comércio, Lisbon's great riverside square. His eldest son, the Crown Prince Luís Felipe, was killed in the same attack. His younger son Manuel, who was also wounded that afternoon, became king at 18 years old, inheriting not a throne of glory, but a dynasty in freefall. Manuel II ruled for just over 2 years. He was by most accounts a decent and conscientious young man, deeply aware of the fragility of his position and genuinely committed to constitutional governance. He tried to work with the opposition, tried to build coalitions, tried to give the Republican movement enough breathing room that it might exhaust itself before it could organize against him. It was not enough. On the night of October the 3rd and into the morning of October the 4th, 1910, military units in Lisbon rose in support of the Republic. Warships in the Tagus River turned their guns on the royal palace at Necessidades. The government of Manuel II collapsed before it could mount a coherent defense. By midday on October the 5th, the Republic was proclaimed from the window of Lisbon's City Hall. Manuel, his mother Queen Amélie, and his grandmother, the former Queen Maria Pia, had already been taken by loyalist officers to the palace at Mafra, north of the capital. From Mafra, they were escorted to the coastal town of Ericeira, where the royal yacht Amelia waited. On the morning of October the 5th, the last king of Portugal stepped onto the deck of that yacht and sailed into the Atlantic. He was 19 years old. He would not return to Portugal for the rest of his life. The exile began in Gibraltar, where the British offered temporary refuge, and then moved to England, where Manuel would spend the next 30 years. He settled first in Twickenham and later in Fulwell Park, a country house in Middlesex, which became the quiet residence of a court in exile that grew smaller and more melancholy with each passing year. The British royal family received him with the formal courtesy due a deposed monarch, but England was not Portugal, and Fulwell Park was not Lisbon. Manuel occupied himself with what exiled kings occupy themselves with: correspondence, ceremony, and the cultivation of a claim that no one with the power to restore it seemed particularly interested in honoring. He was not entirely without resources. The Braganzas had managed to hold on to some private assets, and Manuel's mother, Queen Amélie, a French princess by birth and a woman of formidable practical intelligence, had taken steps before the fall to ensure that certain family funds were beyond the reach of the new republic. But the scale of what was lost was staggering. The palaces, the royal art collections, the libraries, the estates, the jewels held in the name of the crown, all of it passed to the Portuguese state. The royal family's personal property was entangled with the property of the monarchy in ways that took years of legal argument to partially resolve, and even those resolutions returned only a fraction of what had been taken. The palaces that bore the Braganza name were among the grandest in Iberia. The Palacio Nacional de Mafra, whose construction João V had ordered in the early 18th century as an act of thanksgiving after the birth of an heir, was a building of such monumental ambition that its basilica contained 6 pipe organs and its library held 36,000 volumes. The Palacio Nacional de Queluz outside Lisbon was Portugal's answer to Versailles, with its reflecting pools and painted tile panels. These were not merely residences, they were the physical argument for the dynasty's permanence, built to last centuries. The Republic inherited them all. In Portugal itself, the new Republic moved quickly to stamp out the institutions of the old order. The House of Braganza was stripped of its citizenship. Members of the dynasty were barred from returning. The Republican government, deeply insecure in its early years and facing constant instability, treated any possibility of monarchist restoration as an existential threat. There were genuine attempts to use that threat. A series of incursions across the Spanish border, organized by royalist militants known as the Paivas, tried to destabilize the Republic from the north in 1911 and 1912. They failed, but they gave the Republic the pretext it needed to maintain emergency measures and to treat the exiled Braganzas as potential instruments of subversion, even when there was little evidence that Manuel himself was directing anything. The truth was more complicated and considerably sadder. Manuel was not a man given to plots. He was a scholar, a serious collector of rare books, whose library of early Portuguese printing would eventually become one of the most significant private collections in Europe. He was a genealogist, a musician, a man who found genuine pleasure in the quieter pursuits of an educated aristocrat. His exile was not the active defiance of an Bourbon pretender scheming at the border. It was a life lived at a careful remove from the country he had lost, sustained by ritual, by correspondence with loyalists who grew fewer each year, and by the particular melancholy of someone who knows that the world has moved on without him. He married Princess Augusta Victoria of Hohenzollern in 1913, a match that was dynastic in its logic, and by the accounts of those who knew them, genuinely warm in its reality. They had no children. The absence of an heir became one of the defining facts of Manuel's exile, shaping not only his personal life, but the entire question of what the Braganza dynasty would become after him. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. While Manuel lived out his quiet English exile, Portugal itself descended into one of the most chaotic periods in its modern history. The First Republic, proclaimed with such revolutionary enthusiasm in October 1910, managed to cycle through 45 governments in 16 years. The country lurched between factions, between radical anti-clerical Republicans and moderate constitutionalists, between labor movements and military interventionists, between those who wanted genuine democracy and those who simply wanted a different set of hands on the same levers of power. Portugal entered the First World War on the Allied side, partly to secure British support for its African colonies, and suffered catastrophic losses at the Battle of La Lys in April 1918, where the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps was overwhelmed by a German offensive that came within hours of breaking the Allied line. The human and financial cost of that war, added to the chronic instability of republican governance, made the Portugal of the 1920s a country that was deeply exhausted and increasingly willing to accept authoritarian solutions. In 1926, a military coup ended the First Republic. 6 years later, a former economics professor named António de Oliveira Salazar consolidated power and began building what would become the Estado Novo, a right-wing Catholic dictatorship that would govern Portugal for 42 years. The Estado Novo presented itself as a restoration of order and national identity, and it dressed its authoritarianism in the language of tradition, faith, and hierarchy. It was not, however, a monarchist regime. Salazar was a careful and pragmatic man who understood that the monarchist cause could be useful as a symbol of continuity without being allowed any actual power. He kept the Braganzas at arm's length, permitted certain royalist associations to operate, and used the imagery of Portugal's imperial and dynastic past as nationalist decoration while ensuring that no actual restoration ever became a serious political possibility. Manuel II watched all of this from Fulwell Park. He had watched the First Republic tear itself apart and had watched a dictatorship rise from the wreckage. And there had been a moment, in the early 1920s, when it seemed possible that the chaos might create an opening for his return. In 1921, he had issued a manifesto from exile, setting out the conditions under which he might consider accepting a restoration: a free plebiscite, genuine constitutional guarantees, a role for the monarchy as a stabilizing institution rather than an absolute authority. The response from Portugal was muted. The Republic's supporters had no interest in the offer, and the monarchist movement itself was divided between those who supported Manuel and those who backed a rival claimant from the Miguelite branch of the family, a dynastic split that had its roots in the civil wars of the 1830s and that continued to drain the royalist cause of whatever unity it might otherwise have mustered. Manuel had himself been trying to resolve that division, conducting negotiations with the Miguelite pretender that had, by the summer of 1932, reached a preliminary agreement. The question of succession, the question of which branch of the family held the legitimate claim, seemed close to resolution. And then, on the 2nd of July 1932, Manuel II died at Fulwell Park. He was 42 years old. The cause was recorded as acute edema of the glottis. He had complained of a sore throat the previous day and was dead within hours. He left no children and no signed agreement with the Miguelite branch. Queen Amélie, who had survived her husband the king, her son the crown prince, and the assassination that had taken both of them from her in a single afternoon in 1908, outlived Manuel as well. She had spent the years of her own exile with considerably more energy than her son, traveling widely, painting, photographing, pursuing scientific interests with a seriousness that drew genuine admiration from people who encountered her outside the formal rituals of exile. She died in Versailles in 1951, at the age of 84, having outlasted the republic that had driven her out, outlasted the monarchy's last king, and outlasted the particular world she had been born into so completely that the country she was buried apart from had become almost unrecognizable. She never returned to Portugal. The Portuguese government did not invite her, and she did not ask. The death of Manuel without an heir meant that the Braganza claim passed to the Miguelite line, specifically to Duarte Nuno, Duke of Braganza, a great-great-grandson of Miguel I, the absolutist king whose conflict with the constitutional branch of the family had defined and divided Portuguese politics for nearly a century. Duarte Nuno had been born in Seeburg, Austria in 1907 and had spent his life in Central Europe, deeply embedded in the world of Catholic aristocratic exiles. He was educated in Austrian and German schools, spoke Portuguese with the particular distance of someone who had learned it as the language of an elsewhere, and carried the Braganza name in a world where that name meant something to historians and almost nothing to the politicians who might have acted on it. He was, by the terms of the agreement that Manuel had been close to finalizing at his death, the acknowledged heir of the unified Braganza claim. Under Salazar's Estado Novo, Duarte Nuno was permitted to return to Portugal in 1950, after 39 years of his family's exile from the country. The return was carefully managed. He was not welcomed as a pretender or a future king. He was welcomed as a private citizen, a member of a distinguished family, a symbol of historical continuity, that Salazar found useful without finding it threatening. Salazar had no ideological objection to monarchy in the abstract, but he had a precise and enduring objection to any authority that might rival or constrain his own. The Braganzas could return as aristocrats. They could not return as claimants. Duarte Nuno married Maria Francisca of Orleans and Braganza in 1946, and the couple settled in Coimbra. They had 3 sons. The dynasty had heirs again, living on Portuguese soil, speaking Portuguese, educated in Portuguese institutions. But they had no political role, no formal recognition, no prospect of a throne. They were Braganzas in a country that was governed by a man who had spent 4 decades ensuring that the question of monarchy would never become a serious political question. The Estado Novo fell in April 1974, in one of the most peaceful revolutions the 20th century produced. The Armed Forces Movement, a group of military officers who had grown exhausted and disillusioned by Portugal's colonial wars in Africa, where young men were dying in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau for an empire that most of the country had stopped believing in, moved against the dictatorship in the early hours of the 25th of April. The signal for the operation was a song, a fado song by Zeca Afonso called Grandola, Vila Morena, broadcast on national radio just after midnight. By morning, the regime had collapsed. Salazar himself had been dead since 1970, replaced by his chosen successor Marcelo Caetano, who surrendered to the revolutionary officers without the bloodshed that everyone had feared. The Carnation Revolution, named for the flowers that Lisbon's citizens placed in the barrels of the soldiers' rifles, ended 42 years of dictatorship and began the process of building a democratic republic. The question of whether that republic might become a monarchy was raised almost immediately by royalist associations that had survived under Salazar in various forms. A plebiscite on the form of government, they argued, was the democratic thing to do. Let the people choose. The argument went nowhere. The political momentum of 1974 was entirely on the side of the Republic, and the Constituent Assembly that drafted Portugal's democratic constitution in 1975 and 76 embedded the Republican form of government so deeply in the document that changing it would require a level of political consensus that no monarchist movement has come close to achieving since. The revolution was against the dictatorship, but the republic it restored was the Republic of 1910, and the Republic of 1910 had defined itself against the monarchy. That chain of associations proved remarkably hard to break. Duarte Nuno died in Coimbra in 1976, 2 years after the revolution that had finally made his return to Portugal permanent, and 2 years before he could have known whether the new democracy would find any room for the institution his family represented. He was 68 years old. The headship of the house passed to his eldest son Duarte Pio, Duke of Braganza, who was born in Bern, Switzerland in 1945, and who had grown up between Switzerland and Portugal, educated partly in exile and partly in the country that his family had once ruled. Duarte Pio became, and remains, the most publicly visible member of the dynasty in living memory. He married Isabel de Heredia in 1975, and the couple have 3 children, Afonso, born in 1978, Denise, in 1979, and Miguel, in 1986. He has engaged with Portuguese public life in ways that earlier pretenders in exile could not, giving interviews, attending national ceremonies, speaking about Portuguese history and identity with the fluency of someone who actually lives in the country and has watched it change across 5 decades of democracy. He has made no secret of his view that a constitutional monarchy would serve Portugal better than the current republic, but he has pursued that view through conversation and presence rather than through political organization or formal candidacy. His public appearances at historical commemorations, his willingness to discuss the dynasty's role in Portuguese exploration and culture, and his careful avoidance of anything that could be read as political agitation have given him a profile that is genuinely respected even among people who have no interest in a restoration. His argument, stated with patient consistency across many years, is that the monarchy represents a form of national continuity that stands above the partisan divisions of democratic politics, that a crowned head of state who reigns but does not govern could provide a kind of institutional stability that a directly elected president, who is inevitably a political figure, cannot. The Portuguese public has listened to this argument with a kind of benign indifference that is itself revealing. Polls over the decades have consistently shown that a small but persistent minority of Portuguese, somewhere between 10 and 20% depending on how the question is asked, express sympathy for a monarchist restoration. That number has never translated into a political movement capable of putting the question seriously before the electorate. The Republic is embedded in Portuguese identity in ways that the Estado Novo, paradoxically, helped to cement. The dictatorship's use of imperial and dynastic imagery as nationalist decoration meant that by the time democracy arrived, those images were associated with authoritarianism rather than with the constitutional monarchy that the Braganzas had actually embodied. The revolution of 1974 was against Salazar, but the republic it defended was the Republic of 1910, and the Republic of 1910 had defined itself against the monarchy. That chain of associations has proven remarkably durable. What the Braganzas lost in 1910 was never fully recovered. The palaces went to the state and became museums, among the finest in Europe. The Palacio Nacional de Mafra, the Palacio de Pena above Sintra, the Palacio Nacional de Queluz with its French-influenced gardens stretching along the road between Lisbon and Sintra, all of these passed into public hands and are visited by millions of tourists every year who see the grandeur of the dynasty without necessarily connecting it to a living family. Manuel II's extraordinary library of early Portuguese and Iberian printed books, assembled across the years of his Twickenham exile with the devotion of a true bibliophile, was sold after his death and eventually found its way to the Biblioteca Nacional in Lisbon. It is one of the most important collections of incunabula and 16th century printing in the Portuguese-speaking world. The man who built it is remembered mainly in the context of the library, not in the context of the dynasty. The palace at Necessidades, from whose windows Lisbon watched the Republic proclaimed in October 1910, became the headquarters of the Portuguese Foreign Ministry. It is one of the physical remnants that the visitor to Lisbon can still find, can still stand outside and look up at, and see the building in which a dynasty ended and a century of turbulent Republican politics began. Queen Amelie's photographs, taken across decades of European travel with a seriousness of artistic purpose that set her apart from the royal amateurs of her generation, are held in archives in Portugal and elsewhere, catalogued and studied as documents of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She worked in the medium before it was considered appropriate for royal women to have independent intellectual pursuits. She pursued marine biology with similar purpose, contributing to published studies on Atlantic species from a laboratory she established at Cascais. They show a woman who refused to be defined entirely by the catastrophe that shaped her life, who looked at the world through a lens and found in that act of looking a form of continuity that exile could not take from her. The grave of Manuel II is at the church of São Vicente de Fora in Lisbon, in the Braganza pantheon that holds the remains of most of the dynasty's kings and queens. He was returned to Portugal after his death, as the exile law that barred him in life could not bar him in death. He lies among his ancestors in the building they endowed, in the city they built, in the country they ruled for 270 years. It is one of those facts that resists easy interpretation. The body came home. The dynasty did not. Duarte Pio, who today holds the title of Duke of Braganza and serves as the head of the royal house, lives in Portugal, speaks to Portuguese journalists, and attends Portuguese national occasions. His children have Portuguese names and Portuguese lives. The dynasty is present, in that sense, in a way that the Ottomans scattered across Nice and Beirut could not be for decades, in a way that the Habsburgs in their Madeira exile and their European parliamentary careers were present in a more formal register. The Braganzas are there, on the ground, in the country. What they do not have is any institutional role, any formal recognition, any mechanism by which the claim they carry could be converted into the office they once held. Portugal's constitution does not permit a restoration without a process that has never been initiated and shows no signs of being initiated. The country that the Carnation Revolution rebuilt has stabilized, joined the European Union, rebuilt its economy through decades of difficulty, and emerged as a functioning democracy with no apparent appetite for reopening the constitutional question. The monarchy is history. The Braganzas are history, present in the living form of a family that has adapted, that has stayed, that has not gone away. But history, in the end, is what they are. There is something that does not quite resolve in that accounting, something the archive leaves open. Manuel II sailed away from Ericeira on the morning of October 5, 1910, on a royal yacht named for his mother. He was 19 years old. He had been king for 2 years and 17 days. He spent the next 32 years in England, cataloging his books, corresponding with loyalists, watching Portugal from a distance that was as much psychological as geographical. He died without children, without a signed agreement that might have unified the monarchist cause, without having set foot in his country again. Those who attended the royal bibliophile in his later years at Fulwell Park described a man who spent his mornings among his books and his afternoons in correspondence, who spoke of Portugal with the precise detail of someone who had memorized a country he could no longer visit. His library catalogues, written in his own hand, survive and are among the most meticulous documents of their kind from the period, a record kept with the discipline of someone who understood that careful attention to what exists is the only answer to the fact of loss. His last reported words, according to the account preserved by those who attended him at Fulwell Park, were in Portuguese, spoken quietly in the hours before the edema closed his throat. What he said was not recorded in the official death notice, and is preserved only in the recollection of household staff whose names do not appear in the formal documents of the period. The archive of his personal papers, partially held in Portugal and partially in collections that have not been fully catalogued, remains a document that scholars continue to work through. There are letters that have not been published, correspondence from the years of negotiation with the Miguelite branch that ended, unfinished, the summer he died. The record stops where it always stops, at the moment when the outcome might have been different, at the moment the thread was cut. The yacht that carried him away from Portugal in 1910 was eventually seized and repurposed. The country he left has outlasted every government he knew, has buried and rebuilt and transformed itself across a century of extraordinary change. The palace at Necessidades still stands above the Tagus. The books he loved are in the National Library. The Pantheon at São Vicente holds his remains beside the kings who came before him. What the record shows, when you place those facts beside each other, is a dynasty that did not vanish but did not return, a family that survived without a country, and a country that endured without its kings. Whether that gap ever closes is a question that 1910 opened and that no one alive has yet answered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.